The thing that I hear the most is that every single person I know has come up with a plan to save comics.
This is absolutely a golden age that we're in now. It's so easy to make your content commercially viable. You put up a Tumblr, you get subscribers, you tweet about it.
People think like, oh, comics are for a certain type of person. They're a medium that people mistake for a genre. Well, I actually think every person likes comics deep down.
Hello everyone, welcome to Kickstarter HQ for Kickstarter Talking Shop, comics in the past, present, and future. Tonight we've got some great guests to talk to you about comics in the past, present, and future. We've got Josh O'Neill of Locust Moon Press, publishers of Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream, which just today was nominated for 2 Eisner Awards. Congratulations, yes. Also with us is Karen Green, who, among many other credits, is the graphic novel librarian at Columbia University and producer of a documentary called She Makes Comics. Then we'll have John Roberts, co-founder of Comixology, and then they'll come up here and present a little bit, and then Charles Brownstein, executive director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, will come and lead a nice discussion among all of them, so enjoy. Oh, first up, Josh O'Neill of Locust Moon Press.
Hey everybody, thanks for the introduction, Jamie. Not only was the Little Nemo tribute that we put together at Locust Moon nominated for 2 Eisners today, but the IDW Little Nemo book was nominated for 2 Eisners, and the Taschen Complete Little Nemo collection was nominated for 2 Eisners. So that's 6 Eisners for Winsor McCay. He's got some big coattails, and I'm proud to be one of many, many people hanging on to them for dear life. So, I guess if the theme is comics past, present, and future, we've been invited to speak here because this Little Nemo project, in which a lot of amazing cartoonists pay tribute to Little Nemo and Winsor McCay, is this sort of beautiful window into the past through the visions of all these amazing modern cartoonists. For those of you that don't know, Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream is a tribute to Winsor McCay, in which we asked many of the greatest cartoonists of today to create their own new Little Nemo strips. So Winsor McCay, for people who aren't aware, was an animator, an illustrator, and cartoonist from the turn of the century who completely transformed the several media in which he was involved. He was, depending on who you ask, either the inventor or one of the inventors of animation. He produced over 10,000 hand-drawn cells for Gertie the Dinosaur alone, which was just one of his many short films. He created ongoing comic strips like Sammy Sneeze, Dreams of the Rarebit Fiend, Hungry Henrietta, Pilgrim's Progress. But for my personal taste, his most amazing accomplishment is Little Nemo in Slumberland, which was a full-color, full-page Sunday newspaper strip that ran intermittently between 1904 and 1926. Each strip follows the dream of this kid Nemo, and each strip ends with Nemo waking up back in his room, usually either falling out of bed or tangled up in the sheets or calling for his mom. McCay used this incredibly simple format of a dream and then a return to reality, and the gigantic broadsheet newspaper page, which is significantly bigger than newspapers are even today, to explore the endless possibilities of comics and sequential storytelling. It was then, and it remains, one of the greatest comics ever created and one of the truly singular bodies of work in the history of American art. So we decided to bastardize it in the most Baroque and grandiose way that we possibly could. So we got 140 of the best cartoonists in the world to make their own Little Nemo strips. We gave very little editorial guidance, except to say that, like Little Nemo, each strip has to be a dream, and they all have to end with one final panel in which the dreamer returns to reality. So I thought I would show you guys some of the strips that I thought played with McCay's inspiration in interesting ways. This is Peter Bag's strip, which takes McCay's classic circus mirror trope in which the characters are distorted and stretched across the page. I've always loved the way that these McCay panels use the giant space of the page to kind of take control of your eyes. You have to take in the whole page all at once. You can't look at it panel by panel because the composition is so strange and startling. And I thought Peter's strip was a great example of an artist bringing McKay's influence into their own style. That's just a classic Peter Bagge strip in Peter's totally immediately identifiable illustration style. But bringing in some of the McKay influence makes it a little bit bigger and bolder and more illustrative than Pete's very intimate storytelling style usually is. And I thought draws attention to what an incredible cartoonist Pete is. This is a strip that takes almost the opposite approach. J.G. Jones has a very gorgeous, painterly, and also immediately recognizable style as an artist. But for this strip, he figured out how to imitate McKay as closely as he possibly could. He used this classic, those are the steps of the Palace of Slumberland. So he used that setting. And he played with the fourth wall, as McKay loved to do. The premise of his strip is that Nemo's looking up at the stars saying, it's so beautiful, but it's too much. I can't look at it all at once. And so Flip says, well, it's very simple. You just draw a little box around it. And then they're stuck inside this box. It's a 3-page strip. This is the second page. They're stuck inside this box. And he says, well, now I can't see the moon. And so they bust out of the box and end up with a tear at the bottom. That's just perfect. So it's a sort of little fable on the artistic process. And I thought of incredibly beautiful tribute to McKay that I think McKay would have been delighted by. Most of Little Nemo is very joyful and delightful and often very funny. Sometimes it could be very, very dark, and it addressed a lot of themes of loss and aging and frailty and failure and death. This is, for my money, the saddest of all the many sad Little Nemo strips. It's his New Year's Day strip, in which Father Time, who always shows up every New Year's Day, decides to bring Nemo to the office where they keep the years. And he's giving him a little tour of this office, and he keeps taking down years, and he hands them to Nemo, and Nemo immediately becomes whatever age he's going to be in that year. And by the time he gets to the impossibly distant year of 1999, he hands Nemo that year, and he's an old man, and you can't really see, but the final panel is just Nemo alone saying, please make me a little boy again. And so J.H. Williams sort of ran with that concept, and instead of numbering the panels as McKay did sequentially, he numbered each panel with the age of Nemo as he's moving through his entire life. And as he's getting older and older, you can see just the years piling up and rushing by. And I thought it was just a beautiful, J.H. Williams is one of the most formally innovative artists in comics. And I thought it was interesting he chose, instead of to do something really visual with some insane composition, he just decided to show how much of a person's life you can fit onto one broadsheet page. It's a really beautiful one. This one was really interesting to me. This is an artist named Katie Moody. She took a sort of conceptual approach. She actually traced a classic McKay strip and changed the text and used variable coloring techniques and changed some of the artwork to trace this individual strip throughout history in all the places it's been replicated and stolen or paid homage to. So she's telling the story of how she first saw this strip reused as part of a Raggedy Ann cartoon. And she's sort of tracing her own journey through seeing this stuff and not knowing what its source was, and eventually, as she studied the history of cartooning, moving back to McKay. This is Cole Closser's strip. This is an incredibly beautiful and mournful strip that takes place in sort of like a faded, forgotten slumberland. So we're following Flip, who's the trickster character, who's sometimes Nemo's nemesis and sometimes his best friend in these stories. He finds the fossils of Bosco the dragon, who was a character from the McKay strips, who was sort of the vehicle that Nemo and the princess would use to ride around Slumberland. He's a dragon who has a throne inside his mouth. So Flip finds his bones, and this is many years later, and he's trying to think back to their Slumberland adventures, but he can't really remember anything. He can't even really, he's trying to remember the boy's name. And he says, I can't remember his name. I think his name was No One, which is actually what Nemo means in Latin. And up there in the very corner on the top right is a drawing of McKay's actual house in Sheepshead Bay, which McKay would often work into his own Little Nemo strips. One of the most difficult aspects of this project was dealing with the unfortunate character of the jungle imp, who was a cartoonish racial caricature of an African savage who speaks gibberish. McKay was a person of his time, and though he was very politically progressive in many ways, his work betrayed some very unenlightened views about race. The last thing we wanted to do was gloss over the problematic aspects of Little Nemo, and it would have felt dishonest to remove or literally whitewash a character who was, for better or for worse, very central to the cast of Slumberland. So our best solution was just to address it head on and allow each artist to make of the imp what they would. Farrell Dalrymple, for instance, had the imp speaking perfect English, and when Nemo says to him, "Why can I understand what you're saying?" He says, "Maybe you just used to be more racist in your dreams." Cliff Chang, later on you'll see, shows the imp removing removing like a mask of his sort of Sambo appearance to reveal a naturalistically drawn African boy and just saying, "How silly." But my favorite approach, and the most direct one, I thought, was Ronald Wimberly, who makes the imp the hero of his strip and gives him a sort of nobility and personality that he never got from McKay. So this beautiful strip, it's hard to notice upon first seeing it, but all the rocks and trees are actually pencils and hands. And so he's sort of simultaneously paying tribute to McKay's incredible ambition while also calling McKay out for something that needs to be called out and addressed. Jim Rugg's incredibly minimal, conceptual Little Nemo strip plays brilliantly with the concept of the wake-up panel. I think that panel was a very freeing thing for McKay and for a lot of the artists who contributed to this book, because it basically functions as a safety net. No matter how bad things get, Nemo will always wind up back in his bed, safe and sound. McKay could get into whatever kind of insane experiment struck his fancy without having to worry about how to get out of it. He could just click his heels and go back to Kansas. So Rugg's strip asks, what if he missed? What if that constant safety wasn't there? It shows the sort of high wire act that McKay was engaging in with some of these strips. And it also shows that the greatest use of this giant broadsheet page doesn't have to necessarily involve drawing anything on it. The page itself has this enormous power. And then we have Galen Showman's strip, who was also playing with the concept of that wake-up panel. In his strip, it begins with Nemo falling out of bed and breaking his neck. And so in the rest of the strip, he's in traction, and it involves the Slumberland characters and kind of like a Marx Brothers movie trying to bust him out of the hospital while he's saying, I need to stay here. These are two strips that speak about, or even to, Winsor McKay very directly. The first is Cliff Chang's strip that I was speaking about before. There's the imp taking off his mask. And it shows the Little Nemo characters arriving at McKay's house. There's that Sheepshead Bay home. And they wake him up and ask him to draw one final strip, which I thought was a very lovely idea for this tribute book that we were putting together, because that sometimes felt like what we were doing, sort of reviving McKay with one collective artistic seance. The other is Phil Barlow's Winsor McKay in Reality strip, which is actually a biography of Winsor McKay in one page. And it shows how his incredible genius was shackled by his obligations to William Randolph Hearst and the New York Herald. This strip ends by very directly mocking the book that it's in. McKay is dying of a stroke in the wake-up panel, and his wife is saying, "Oh, what a pity. But now that the works of Winsor McCay are in the public domain, he can be imitated by artists with a fraction of his skill and vision." These are two examples of just how far you can run from the source material, how far you can take it within that format and still be true to its spirit. The first is a fine artist from Boston named Raul Gonzalez, whose strip is about the dangers of illegal border crossing, drawn in the style of the Mexican Day of the Dead. The second is Maël Delavu, who created this transcendent cut paper Little Nemo strip, which not only breaks the fourth wall, but disrupts the two-dimensional nature of the page with the reality of the strip breaking down and the paper crumpling and curling off the page, and the panel numbers, which are on all the panels, just kind of falling down towards the bottom of the page. Or there's Paul Ravoche's strip, which breaks beyond the single page of most of these strips and spreads across a double-page spread and is just truly exhilaratingly joyful, like many of the Little Nemo strips are. We decided only to include one actual McKay strip in the book. This is the final page of the book. And instead of going with one of the really fancy, incredibly beautiful pages that brim with ambition and detail and pure illustrative power, we decided to go with one that showcases his unique sense of humor and simultaneously commented on the book that precedes it. In this strip, the Slumberland characters are drawn progressively more and more poorly as each panel goes by, and they're complaining that the artist isn't drawing them properly. By the final panel, they're just these hastily drawn stick figures. Incidentally, those are totally awesome stick figures. And I don't think McKay was capable of drawing anything badly, even if that was his intention. I would love to read an ongoing strip that was drawn in exactly that style. But anyway, this was the strip that we used to close out the book. That was our way of letting McKay have the last word, and having that last word be a sort of half-hearted shrug and maybe even a little bit of a dig. Because McKay was an artist who knew with incredible clarity just how much could be achieved in these brand new media of cartooning and animation. He was asked at some point in the 20s to give a speech for a dinner of animators. And McKay, who was, by all reports, a very playful, friendly, delightful, sort of elfin type of man, got up and said, essentially, "I created this medium a decade ago, and none of you have moved it forward at all. You've just commercialized and cheapened it. You're exploiting it when you should be exploring it." I am not entitled to speak for Winsor McCay, but I think that if he could see the comics industry today, that though he might be baffled by certain things, like the proliferation of eyes that shoot laser beams out of them, he would be thunderstruck by the incredible variety of singular voices who are constantly expanding the borders of this medium, of which he was one of the true architects. I think he'd be enthralled by the fact that so many artists' true visions can find expression, that they're able to break the chains of corporate bondage that he struggled with in the grips of the New York Herald and William Randolph Hearst. I think he'd be heartened by the existence of people like Jamie Tanner and his colleagues at Kickstarter, who are creating and maintaining this incredible platform that makes these starry-eyed passion projects possible. And I think if he were at a dinner attended by the artists who contributed to this book, he would feel right at home, and he wouldn't yell at anybody. Thank you very much.
So, following Winsor McCay, no pressure there. Hello, I'm Karen Green. I'm a librarian. I'm not a cartoonist. I'm here not necessarily as a librarian. I'm here a little bit. I'm going to start off a little bit by explaining why I got to stand here at all. But I'm mostly here as one of the co-producers of a documentary about women in comics called She Makes Comics. So a little background. In 2005, we had 3 graphic novels in the Columbia University Library. They were there not as comics. They were there for their content. So they were really only being read for a fraction of their potential. They were assigned in Holocaust studies classes or Middle Eastern studies classes, etc. I thought we should have more, and I made a successful pitch to do so, and today we have over 5,000 titles. In about a dozen languages. And we do all sorts of events, which some of you may have attended. This is our oversized section where all the IDW artist editions are. And all the way at the top, you can just barely see it, is the corner of our copy of Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream, of our oversize. If you want to be on the mailing list for events, just let me know, she said, plugging mercilessly. In the fall, I've left something out. In 2010, I moved on from merely buying materials for the circulating collection. I was asked, as a result of Chris Claremont contacting me and saying, can I give my archives to your library? I was asked to start finding more comics creators who are interested in donating their archives to our rare book and manuscript library. And in the fall, I did a nice big exhibition, which I hope will eventually become online, about 165 items, looking at history, precursors of comics, the artistic process, the writing process, fan culture, cosplay, you name it. We have some really fun collections, and we're getting some more that are even more fun. Along the way, I was helped by being invited by Comixology. Thank you, John Roberts, wherever you are. Thank you, John Roberts. You made the logo? I love the logo. To write a column for Comixology back when they still had columns, which I wrote for 4.5 years. That led to me being made an Eisner Judge in 2011 and to sitting on the board of trustees of MoCA, and then when they were absorbed by the Society of Illustrators, sitting on the board of directors of the Society. And when I did this slideshow, I couldn't say it, but I can say now, because it was announced on Monday, I was also asked to be on the jury for the Pulitzer Prize in editorial cartooning. Crazy. So all of this raised my profile from the humble fan that once I had been to a really not so humble fan. Well, slightly humble, mostly humble. And when Marissa Stoddard and her co-producers decided they wanted to make a documentary with Sequart on women in comics, they contacted me, I thought at first merely to be an advisor. And we created, this is one page of about 12 or 14 pages of names of women that I thought they should talk to, why, and in some cases, whether Louise Simonson contacted, waiting to hear Ray December trip. Marissa and her whole crew are in California, so they had to come to New York to talk to a lot of people because, as we all know, comics live in New York City. And as we went down the list of who we wanted to include, I'm an historian by training. I've got my degrees in medieval history. I like to look back as well as look at the present and as well as looking forward. And so we were looking at early creators, women who were pioneers in this medium, like Jackie Orms, who was the first African-American female syndicated, not nationally syndicated, but still syndicated cartoonist, and also very early smart person with licensing. She did a couple of strips, one of which is this one, Patty Joe and Ginger, and she did these little Patty Joe dolls, which she painted their faces by hand, and you could buy this Patty Joe doll, so she exploited the success of her strip. We also looked at women like Marie Severin. This is her in 1979. I really love this photograph. You know, I was tempted. Here's like the librarian's dilemma, right? So it says at the bottom, Elliot R. Brown, do not copy. It's got his copyright. I'm thinking, well, aesthetically, I really should maybe just drop that down so it doesn't show, but I'm a librarian, and We're all about proper citation practice, so Elliot Brown gets his moment in the sun. So Marie Severin started at EC Comics in the 50s. She worked in comics for 40 plus years. She inked, she penciled, she inked, she colored, she lettered. This is a page from An Incredible Hulk, number 104 from 1968. You can't talk about women without talking about the undergrounds. I don't know how many of you are familiar with either Joyce Farmer or Tits and Clits, but both are legendary. Joyce is in her 70s now. She did an amazing graphic novel about dealing with aging parents that came out in 2010 called Special Exits, which she's holding there. But this is one of her covers for Tits and Clits, which was an early underground in which women kind of broke off from the comics that the men were doing to start talking about things that were of more interest to them, since most men were not interested in, well, one of those things at least. Wendy Peeney is not often talked about as a pioneer, which I find quite strange. And some people have opined that that's because of her early Red Sonja cosplay experience, that maybe she was just kind of written off as a dishy broad. Here she's partially in Red Sonja drag. She's got the sword and the leg piece, and the wig. But the rest of it is just the 70s. I was there, I can tell you. She's standing there with Barry Windsor Smith. And ElfQuest was a really innovative and pioneering comic. You may not be that interested in elves, but she was one of the first people to read and use as an influence manga. She had discovered manga. She lived in California. She had friends who found this for her and gave it to her. She absolutely devoured it, and you can absolutely see the influence of manga in her work. And she created this very complex world with very mature themes and a kind of amorphous sexual society that is a lot more interesting than you might think if you just hear the word ElfQuest. So moving from history into the present, we have women like Kelly Sue DeConnick. Do people know why she calls herself Kelly Sue instead of Kelly DeConnick? Anybody? Bueller? Nobody? Pardon? Mary Sue reference? Oh, I like that, but no. Kelly is one of those names that could go either genre, either gender, and she wanted to make sure that people knew when they saw her name that what she wrote was written by a woman. There was no mistaking that it would be written by a man. I also wanted, I'm not sure that we got as many of the kind of modern indie women in the film as I personally would have liked, but there were constraints on time. Miss Lasco Gross is somebody whose work I admire enormously, and this is a page from the the graphic novel that just came out a couple of months ago called Henny, which looks at religious fundamentalism. So not only creators, looking at people behind the scenes as well. Jeanette Kahn, president and publisher of DC Comics. She was named publisher of DC Comics when she was 28 years old. And this is a woman who was not even in comics before. She had been editor and publisher of kids magazines. But she shepherded each of these things. She greenlit each of these things, which many other people who had been in the comics industry for a very long time might not have done. Dark Knight Returns is really quite a departure for DC Comics. And there were those who might not have thought that was the best way to go, but we've seen the result of her choices to do that. You know, probably a more famous publisher of DC Comics nowadays, and who also appears in the documentary, is Paul Levitz, but he doesn't look as good in photos as he does. Sorry, Paul. From publishers to editors, Karen Berger. Karen Berger wasn't necessarily a huge comics fan growing up. She went to college and majored in English Lit and art history. She applied for a job as an assistant to Paul Levitz when he was still an editor, and was so good that she was eventually given her own imprint, Vertigo, where she nurtured you know, Neil Gaiman and Bill Willingham and Brian K. Vaughan and the like into superstardom. And besides people who are directly connected with the comics industry, we wanted to look at people who were perhaps thought of on the periphery, although I think if you know either of these women, you know they're not really on the periphery. Heidi McDonald, who is a journalist, former editor, current journalist, both with Publishers Weekly and with her own blog, The Beat, and Jackie Estrada, who administers the Eisner Awards, holding her own book, which, like She Makes Comics, was funded through a Kickstarter campaign. But really, the most important thing about women in comics is to remember that we read them. When I go to mainstream cons, it's guys, as far as the eye can see, with the occasional woman in costume, it seems. But when you go to indie cons, the majority of people on the floor, and often the majority of the people behind the tables, are women. I've spoken to people who teach cartooning classes at SVA or Parsons, and they say over 50% of the students in their classes are women. This is our medium now. It's not a boys' club. It's, you know, there are corners that are boys' clubs, but it's not a boys' club. And we have the great privilege of thanking the folks at Kickstarter for making this possible. The project was funded early, and it allowed, we were able to hit stretch goals that allowed us to travel more and include more people, and to tell a story. Because the story of comics has a lot of women in it, and they're not necessarily thought of. So I encourage you to take a look at it. I encourage you to come to my events. I encourage you, if you're interested, to come and take a tour of the library. I'd be happy to show you the collection. And I'd be happy to talk with you after the event. So thank you very much.
Hello. My name is John D. Roberts. I'm the co-founder of Comixology, and I am currently the director of Comixology Submit and digital storytelling. So let me just start out. Out of the audience here, how many? I thought that was a question there for a second. Out of the audience here, how many of you create comics in one fashion or other? Ah, nice turnout. That's great. How many of you are familiar with Comixology Submit? Ah, great. Anyone on Comixology Submit? Ah, good. That's great. So just a brief history of Comixology, if you don't know, is that in 2007, three of us got together and decided that we wanted to see if we could build something that takes advantage of technology with, in relation to comics. From my own background, I worked at Marvel Comics back in 2000 and 2002. I built their original foray into digital comics, which was the Dot Comics. I also took their statically driven website and turned it into a dynamically driven, database-driven website. And I basically had come up with this idea of, like, there's got to be a way for technology to help comics, to help grow it. At the time, there was no real easy way to find out what comics were coming out in the store on a weekly basis. So the very first project that I had done was, that basically started the business, was to take this tab-delimited text file that that Diamond would release every week and turn it into something that you could browse and search and make it a lot easier for you to find out what was coming into stores on a weekly basis. That grew into the Comixology website, which Karen used to write articles for us. Basically, I like to call that the TV guide of comics. It would show you what comics were coming out on a weekly basis. Going out to next week, we would it's actually still around. It's pull-list.comixology.com. It would allow you to see what's coming out, create a digital pull list that you could send to your retailer, and basically just give you the information that you need to buy comics. When the iPhone came out, we decided that we wanted to. If you look at the original business plan, we always wanted to get into digital comics. But in 2009, that's when it really happened, like when the iPhone came out. It was at that point where we said, this is a screen where you can actually read on, has great graphics. But when the iPhone, people probably don't remember this, but when the iPhone first came out, you could only download single apps. You could only have a limited number of apps at the time, and you couldn't actually buy things within the apps. So we bided our time. We basically developed the technology. And then when Apple introduced in-app purchasing, we said, all right, this is our moment. So we took this thing that we had built. We reached out to the customers that reached out to the creators that we loved. Mike Allred, Matt Wagner, they're favorites of us. So if you look at the original books that we released, they're right there. Atomic Robo is actually the very first item in our database. Those guys are amazing. And then as we built this huge platform to sell and read digital comics, we decided that we wanted to open that up to creators, independent creators, and that's where Comixology Submit comes in. Comixology Submit, if you don't know, is basically our platform for independent creators and small publishers to easily get onto the Comixology platform, basically opening up that platform to anyone who wants to distribute on it. We have the advantage of digital being international, so when you put your book onto Comixology, it's international. So we basically opened up this world of people who would basically sell within their own zip code to an international audience. We had our missteps. The first time when we first came up with the idea, we didn't think of it. We basically had been working on this thing, and we looked at it, and we said, this is not a good thing. This doesn't help us. It doesn't help the consumers, and it definitely doesn't help the creators. So we basically scrapped it and started over. And that's basically what Comixology Submit comes in. We have this nice little video that I'll show you.
Meet Too Much Coffee Man. He's the star of his own comic. He wants people to read his comic, but doesn't know how. Creators like this inspired us at Comixology to build Submit. Comixology Submit gives creators everywhere the opportunity to showcase and make bank from their work. What are you waiting for, Too Much Coffee Man? Go ahead and click Submit.
Shannon Wheeler was nice enough to allow us to use his Too Much Coffee Man character. Shannon's a great guy if you haven't had a chance to check out his work. We have some of it on Submit. It's great stuff. This is the Comixology Submit website. So we launched Comixology Submit in 2013. We launched it at South by Southwest. In that time, since 2013, we've launched over 3,000 comics, graphic novels, and manga. We've introduced over 1,500 series, and a total, and as you can see, over 150,000 pages of indie comics content, which is amazing. We've had submissions from 38 countries, and as you can see, we have submissions from 6 out of the 7 continents in the world, so excluding Antarctica. So I need someone to volunteer right now to go to Antarctica for us so that we can cross that off our list, because that's on my bucket list now to get something from Antarctica. In 2014, if you were to group Submit as a publisher, we were number 3 in the content delivered. So right behind Marvel and DC, Comixology released more content than any other publisher on the platform. Of that content that we released, we were number 5 in downloads, and we were number 9 in gross revenue, which was up from the year before. We were number 10. And in 2014, we had over 1 million downloads of Comixology Submit titles, which is really amazing. Now, one of the advantages of the modern age of digital comics, of Kickstarter, is that anyone can create a comic. You don't have to rely on the traditional way of doing things. You don't have to go to a publisher. You don't have to get them to approve it. You don't have to solicit it through Diamond Comics. You can go straight to your audience. You can go to Kickstarter. You can get funding for the book. This is an example of some of the books that we have on Comixology Submit that have been kickstarted. You can interact with your audience. You can sell it. Like I said, we're international, so you can reach an international audience. You can reach people that you would not normally have reached before. It's a great time right now to create comics, because the only thing that's really limiting you is yourself and the time that you have to do it. Some of the people up here, Leaving Megalopolis by Gail Simone and Jim Calafiore, they set a record for how much money they had raised for a comic book project. You've got Cafe Racer, from Sean Murphy, Oh Joy Sextoy. Fabian Rangel Jr., as a result of being on Comixology Submit, was actually able to fund 3 successive Kickstarter projects, which he would not have had an opportunity to because of the exposure that we had given him. He actually likes to say that, and so I like to quote him on that. David Gallagher, Only Living Boy, raised money for 2 issues on Kickstarter. We have some recent ones, The Horror Lovers by Valerie D'Orazio, and some newer ones like Lovecraft by Craig Engler. So with Comixology Submit, we basically looked at this challenge. We said, there's a lot of people out there making amazing comics. We have to get those comics and we have to bring them to our audience. We have to find a way to do that. So we introduced the program. We take a lot of care. Comixology Submit is a curated process. So we look at your books to make sure that they are basically up to snuff. We curate them for things like artifacting and pixelation. If you were to use Adobe Acrobat Pro, by default, you're producing a PDF file that we can't use. We look at things like lettering, like Comic Sans. There's a lot of people who like to use Comic Sans. And as you can hear by the snickering, Comic Sans is not actually considered a professional font. My rule of thumb has always been, if it comes free on your computer, you probably shouldn't use it. You can find good fonts at Comic Craft and Blambot. They offer a lot of good fonts. So we look at the content, because we've basically become this caretaker for your content, and this is something that we take very seriously. So we want to make sure that because when you go onto the Comixology platform, you're not just competing with the people that you would sit next to at the tables at conventions. You're actually competing with Marvel and DC, and we want to make sure that what you're producing is able to compete. And so we look at things like, one of the biggest problems we have is someone will open up an InDesign file, 8.5 by 11. They'll stick their comic right in the center, and now you've got this like 2-inch border around your comic page. So we reach out and we say, look, this is a great comic. We want to carry it, but we need you to fix these issues before we can actually put it on the platform. The response has been great. Like I said, we were number 9 in total revenue for 2014, which was up. If you look at Twitter, you have people that love Comixology. We've got more people producing comics right now, which is amazing. I'm repeating myself, but it's been a really great time, and we're really happy to be part of that. I think that's all I got. Thank you.
Well, tough act to follow with all of these outstanding presentations on the tremendous diversity of comics, past, present, and future. And I suppose a nice starting point for our conversation is to go back to something we were talking about in the green room. Those of you here that are longtime comics lovers are familiar with the white box phenomenon, right? So we all go to the conventions and we flip through all of these boxes, and that used to be our only real link to the past. Growing up in comic book stores in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, that was where you had to look to find whatever the history of comics that you were interested in was. And so you had hallowed names of people like Winsor McKay, or people like Jack Kirby, or people like Joyce Farmer. And through word of mouth and through going to conventions and really hunting, you were able to identify this history. But now we live in a time where the entire history of comics is live and at our disposal, whether it is in print as graphic novels. I mean, it boggles my mind now that I can find some incredibly obscure material in these luxurious editions or in these popular editions, or whether it's available digitally. I love going on Comixology every week and seeing new releases. Some really weird-looking Wonder Woman cover from 1972, is there alongside whatever came out last week. Or I've had the privilege of going to Karen's library and going through those stacks. I did a panel on Will Eisner a month ago, and I went there and read through her Spirit archives. And when, geez, everything is here and available in a way that we really could not fathom except as a fantasy a generation ago. And so living in these times where it might be easy to take for granted that the history of comics is at our disposal, I'd like to ask our panelists, what has that done to creativity, and what has that done to the business of comics, knowing that it is all relatively easily within our grasp?
I'm not sure I agree 100% that this is the first generation that's had the past accessible to it. In 1978, when I moved out on my own, I was a member of the Smithsonian, and I got a thing in the mail saying, new book published, Smithsonian Collection of Newspaper Comics. I thought, oh, I like comics. I'll order this. And that's where I discovered Winsor McCay. That's where I discovered George McManus. That's where I discovered Frederick Opper. That's where I discovered Richard Outcolt. That's where I discovered Milton, that's where I discovered Milton Caniff, because Steve Canyon was in the paper, but it wasn't really Caniff. So the past has been there. I think it's more readily accessible now, but I think people have been drawing on the past pretty much all along. I don't know. You may disagree.
I'm not necessarily going to disagree with that. My father was the owner of some of the early trade paperback collections that had come out through Marvel and DC. So I have the the Power of Shazam one, and so he had this shelf of graphic novels and trade paperbacks of stuff that pretty much built my interest in it. So, I've been exposed to this stuff pretty much all my entire life, and being able to see all this older stuff. But one of the nice things about digital that I really love is that you can take some of these older works, digitize them, put them on the platform, and they're new for new people. Like for someone who has never read the stories of our favorite heroes from the 40s or the 50s or even the 60s or the 70s, they get the advantage to read those now as it's a new thing. And it allows, especially with the independent creators, it allows them to introduce their work to an audience who had never possibly heard of them before. I mean, can you imagine Destroyer Duck on Comixology being able to introduce that work to someone who had never heard of it before?
Josh, your work directly draws upon the history and engages contemporary artists, challenges contemporary artists to comment upon it. So how do you think this accessibility of the history of comics is affecting the creativity today?
Well, I sort of agree with Karen that people who are aspiring cartoonists and true devotees of the medium have always been able to dig back and find that stuff. I don't think it's a new thing that young cartoonists would be aware of Winsor McCay. I think they always would have been. But I do think the thing that's changing is the ease of access to stuff like that. So it's not just the people who are so deep into this thing. I remember when I was growing up reading Prince Valiant in the newspaper and not understanding what the hell was going on. But it had a magical glow, and I was fascinated by it, but I was like, I don't get it. And I always wished I could just start at the beginning of Prince Valiant, and I remember thinking, but that will never be possible. There will just never be time. Those are gone. Or when you missed an episode of a TV show, you just be like, well, I'll just never see it. That's a shame. But I do think the fact that part of the appeal of doing a book like the McCay tribute that we put together was the fact that when you walk around a comic convention and say Winsor McCay's name to people, it means something. The idea of doing a McCay tribute is something that's automatically appealing to people in the comics industry. But I think if you were to, I've never done this formally, so I don't know if it's true, but I think if you were to poll comic fans, I think a huge percentage of them would have no idea who Winsor McCay was. Even some people who are really deep into it. It's horrible. So a part of the appeal of doing this book was the idea that people who have these big fan bases like Bill Sienkiewicz or Paul Pope and people like that, you might hear about them being in this book and then say, oh, who's Winsor McCay? and then trace it back to its source. I mean, I only found out about Winsor McCay because I was obsessed with Bill Watterson when I was a kid, and he was like mentioned in passing in like an interview I read with Bill Watterson. So I think like the Katie Moody strip that was like tracing like the material backwards, I think that's how a lot of stuff is discovered. You get into a thing and then you're like, well, where did this thing come from? So I think it's wonderful that for people who get into something modern, they can more easily trace it back through time without having to devote their life to it.
And it's true. I was at SPX, not this last year, but I think the year before when Cole Klosser came out with Little Tommy Lost. I thought, wow, this looks so cool. Tell me, like, who are the cartoonists that you read? He's like, well, I basically don't like any comic that was done after 1932. Alrighty then. And he's like 24 years old. I mean, he's really young.
Yeah,
to me.
and you can actually choose that path through comics now. There's so much material being reissued that if you only want to read comics made before 1940, you actually can, successfully spend thousands of dollars a year only reading comics made before 1940. And John, this raises an interesting point that you brought up when you're talking about Submit, that you're not only competing with your peers at the Artist Alley table, you're competing with Marvel and DC, but I think it even goes further with that. You're actually competing with the entire history of comics.
Yes.
And comics are competing with the entire media spectrum out there. I mean, this is maybe the biggest time of creative expression and availability of creative expression in history. And so moderating that kind of a marketplace, what do you see as the challenges for creative people that are moving into an environment where they are actually competing with the entire history of comics?
No pressure.
No pressure, right.
The biggest challenge that we found is getting people to promote their works, right? We'll have some amazing works that come through Comixology Submit, and you wouldn't know it because the creators don't actually talk about it. And so, I've been working on ways to communicate to them. I mean, promoting yourself is not very natural. It's actually an unnatural thing that you have to fight against. Even myself, it's like I'm not very good at self-promotion. But you have to, in order to succeed, you have to push through that. You have to realize that people actually do care about what it is that you say, and that you should tell people where it is. And one of the amazing things about digital is not only can you tell them about what it is that you're working on, you can point them to a place where they can go and immediately buy it. If I'm in a room with someone and I'm talking to them at a bar or at a convention or something, I can say, hey, I've got this great book. It's on Comixology. Oh, wait, here's the URL. You can go buy it right then and there. And so I think that digital has really opened up the door to help people reach out to their fans and to build new fans. But it's getting over that first hump of you doing it. It's like you can no longer have the attitude of well, if I just put it up, people will find it and it'll be great. It's like, no, people want to know about it. You have to tell them about it. You have to tell them where to find it, help them do that, and because you are competing with basically the history of comics.
And Josh, in addition to being a publisher, Locust Moon is an incredible comic book store. And so can you speak to this question as it relates to the physical environment of competing in the real world and competing against all of these beautiful editions if you're a cartoonist that's coming out today?
Yeah, I mean, it is, there's so much amazing material coming out all the time. I think the challenge for comics at the moment is maybe there's more supply than there is demand. I mean, at Locust Moon, we have all of these, I mean, just the existence of these artist editions, these books that take photographs of original artwork from amazing comics and reprint them at the full size of the original work. It's insane that all these things exist. I know, have a lot of trouble finding a market for that stuff. We carry all that stuff, but we don't sell much of it. Mm-hmm. So I guess in my personal experience as a retailer, you're not that much competing against the history of comics because the vast majority of what we sell, I mean, we sell mostly non-Marvel and DC stuff, mostly independent stuff, but it's all our best-selling books are modern books. And then, you know, like something like when there's like a Jack Kirby artist edition, we'll sell a couple copies of that. But it's not, in my very personal and totally, I can't speak for other stores, but our experience of these incredible archival editions coming out is that we don't sell a lot of them. So,
now, John's recommendation for artists that are getting their work out there is get out there and promote yourself and show people where to buy your material and how to access it. What advice would you give those creators that are looking to get a foothold in the comic book store environment?
Just, I mean, go to stores, talk to them personally. The comic industry is so small, and I don't know how many active comic shops are really out there. I don't think it's more than a few hundred. I'm sure there's more stores than that carry some comics, but things that would qualify as comic shops, I think it's just a few hundred at most. So you can really make relationships with all of them. There's some of them that won't be interested in your stuff, but there's ones like Locust Moon or like Floating World or Bergen Street or these great shops that will really champion the works of cartoonists that they believe in. And if you find a shop with a person there who's really going to try to introduce people to your work and sell it to them, that's the best thing you could possibly find, because people do go to comic shops looking to be introduced to new things. And you can only go to so many conventions a year, you know? Like you need someone out there selling your stuff for you, and that's what a comic shop can do.
Looking at some of the people making comics and looking at this era that we're in, we're experiencing an incredible diversity of expression and a broadening diversity of people expressing using the comics medium. And I think that Karen's work on the She Makes Comics documentary indicates how that trend is happening. Karen, I'm wondering if you could speak to what comics looked like a generation ago, 2 generations ago, and what comics are starting to look like today and where you think we're going.
Well, where we're going is anywhere. You know, the possibilities now with digital especially, that allows you to do things with panels that print doesn't allow. I think Randall Munroe in XKCD is one of the best examples of people who've really experimented with the possibilities of the digital panel. A generation ago, 2 generations ago, you know, I didn't grow up reading superheroes. I didn't grow up going to comic book shops. You know, underground comics were kind of circulated like samizdat when I was in high school in the 70s. I had a subscription to heavy metal in the 80s. And then I bought things via catalog. I had like a Fantagraphics catalog, and I would just order things in the mail. So it was kind of it wasn't a social experience. And I think now there's so many events. There's actually another event even tonight that I wanted to be at. Mohammed Sabaneh, who's this amazing Palestinian cartoonist, is talking at Parsons tonight. There's so many places to go. There's so many people to meet. You don't have to sit in your room anymore. It's all out there waiting for you to just jump in, and the water is warm and welcoming. The people in this industry are so lovely, and they want to talk. You know, I feel like the success of comics will almost ruin that. You know, you can't go to a film festival and expect to walk up to Tilda Swinton and ask her about how she worked on her role, but you can go to a con, and you know, we had Mocha Fest 2 weekends ago. You could walk up to Aileen Kaminsky-Crum and ask her stuff. That's insane. So I think the volume is impressive. I think the possibilities are impressive. I think this is absolutely a golden age that we're in now. You know, I look at the way I build my collection, and I buy mainstream, and I buy alternative and indie. I back a lot of Kickstarter campaigns and put the reward into the collection. I go to cons and I buy things on tables. I buy self-publishing things from Store Envy and Lulu and Etsy. You know, there's a million ways to get comics, and you don't, I'm not even talking about digital, but even for print, you don't even have to leave your door. I mean, you can and you should, but there's so much out there and it's so accessible, and I think that's the biggest change.
One of the interesting things that you mentioned during your presentation is that you'd go to a comic book convention and you'd see this sea of dudes that are engaging with the content. And I can tell you firsthand, in the 13 years I've been at Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and going out to conventions, seemingly every other weekend, that it's definitely, approaching a much more even split in the marketplace. To the degree that the joke was, you had the bored girlfriend phenomenon, and now I'm seeing more often than not the bored boyfriend being dragged around the convention, which is awesome. But, to the panel, how do you see the audience for comics changing, and what changes is that forcing on the business side for us to adapt to serve that audience?
We did a survey last year or the year before, I forget it was, and what we found was that the number that the number of women reading comics, especially digitally through Comixology, has been increasing dramatically. And that we actually had an event where we invited some of the people in to speak to reporters, and what we found was that there are a lot of women finding comics in college and wanting to continue read after college and not knowing where to go. So they discovered digital, and that's how they're able to continue reading. We actually had one individual who said that he buys his comics digitally so that he could hide them from his wife, and that if she were to find out the amount of money that he had actually spent on it, that he would be in trouble.
So interesting.
So digital saves marriages, is what you're telling us.
Well, yeah, it saved my marriage because my wife was not. I still have boxes at my parents' house. But after 2 moves and my wife having to carry these boxes, she's like, no, that's it, So, developing a way to read digitally, I still have boxes. I have a bookcase of boxes at home. But now most of that stuff, fits on my iPad, and I don't have to, store that stuff anymore.
Can I just say, I teach a summer course on comics that gets maybe 20 to 25 students, the majority of whom have never read comics before. They actually take the course because they think it's an easy way to get an English lit requirement out of their way. They don't know that it's not going to be easy with me. But they come in and they haven't read comics, or maybe they started reading comics after watching Batman the Animated Series. That was a gateway drug for a lot of people. And the first thing I have them read is Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden's How to Read Nancy and Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. And I have them write a process paper, like a 1 or 2 page opinion paper every week. And that first week, all these papers come in and they're like, I thought comics were just stupid or for people who weren't very bright or just for kids, but comics are amazing. They've got these road to Damascus moments that they're having, and I think about them as my little spores. I send them out into the university now with this love of comics, and they're going to do comics papers in their non-comics classes, and I see this more and more and more. When I started the collection, nobody was teaching with comics. I knew that nobody really could unless there was a collection to draw on, and now one of our tenured faculty, Jeremy Dauber, co-teaches a course with Paul Levitz every other year called the American Graphic Novel. The first year they got 80 students. The second year they got 75. This is pulling in massive amounts of readers, and in those classes as well, when they kind of poll and say, when did you get into comics? A lot of them have never read comics before. They're comics curious.
Well, you raise a really interesting point in that now comics are really at the heart of popular culture. And whether it's the Daredevil ads all over New York City right now, or the giant Avengers ad that I saw at 34th Street when I was getting on the subway, or even quieter films like Ghost World in the last 10 years, American Splendor in the last 10 years. There's so many gateway opportunities into comics. How does that impact the audience? What are you seeing on the ground from your 3 different vantage points for how popular media that actually gets comics, which is a lot different than popular media used to do, how is that affecting the audience and the audience's attitude towards the source material?
Well, if I can go back to the gender shift for a second, just from the perspective of a retailer, that's been a gigantic seismic change in the comics industry. All of our best-selling books at Locust Moon are the books that have the most female readers. It's Saga and Miss Marvel and Lumberjanes and Spider-Woman, exclusively all of our top-selling books. I really think, I think probably it's approaching some kind of parity between male and female readers, and I don't think it's anywhere near done. I think in 10 years, there are going to be a lot more female comic readers than there are male readers, just like there are more female readers of novels than there are male readers. And at the Locust Moon Comics Festival, which we run every year, I remember my partner Andrew and I just going over the list and being like, wow, there's a lot of female exhibitors, and doing the math and realizing it was 51%, which is the same proportions as the human race. So, but yeah, I think that's a giant change for the positive, because I feel like women have probably always wanted to read comics. It's just like the comics weren't there for them, and now they are, and it's a great thing. And it seems like they're hungry for more, which is a huge thing for the comics market.
We see the same thing at Comixology. Like if you look at our top selling lists, I think there was one week where it was like Thor, Miss Marvel, Captain Marvel, Batgirl were like leading. I think at one point it was like more than half of the top selling list was comics dominated by a female character or a female creator. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, sometimes we get like cynical and just go, okay, Ladybug, jack it up.
Yeah.
Because you just know they're going to sell. It's an amazing thing.
And what about the, where are they coming from, these new readers?
I do think that the existence, like you were saying, the existence of comics in the greater pop culture marketplace is bringing in a lot of people. Though an experience we've had a lot is that people love superhero movies. They come in not really having read comics, but curious about them because of these superhero movies. They want superhero comics. We sell them some superhero comics and they don't like them. And then we find other, they end up reading Saga. It's interesting because for a lot, there are a lot of amazing superhero comics out there. I love superhero comics, but they're not always doing a great job of serving the new reader. Like when the Avengers movie was so big, we got a giant influx of people, especially young people, like kids, like 12-year-old kids, that, like with their parents who were like, oh, my kid loves the Avengers. What should I buy? And I don't know. Like the only things that would be appropriate for them would be things that are so old-fashioned they would hate them. Like they were things that were drawn in 1971. The pet Avengers is the only thing you can sell. It's like, oh, do you want the one where like Ant-Man beats up his girlfriend, or the so it's interesting. I think superhero movies are bringing in an enormous amount of readers. And for other characters like Batman, there's more stuff that's more like the movies that you can say, here's something. But I don't think that the superhero comics are doing a great job of taking that enormous interest that they've generated and translating it into comics readers. Because interest in Avengers comics flared up and then died, for us at least. I don't know how it is in other shops.
But now you've got television as well that comes into people's homes for free, and you've got iZombie and Flash and Daredevil and Walking Dead, obviously, And I think the less mainstream titles, when people go from the television to the comic, that's actually not as much of a disappointment. If you go from the series Walking Dead to the comic, you're not going to be sorry.
That's a show that generates a ton of readers for the comic. I'd
be interested to see how iZombie does.
Yeah, I'm curious too. And Daredevil, I think, is gonna. And it's great because there are so many great Daredevil books that you don't need to be steeped in 20 years of Marvel history.
And
I mean, you can just go straight to the
Yeah.
Frank Miller stuff. There's
Yeah,
also
exactly.
And
there's
John,
also
you
the new
actually
Mark
have
Waid stuff
data
that's
to this
amazing.
point.
Yeah, I mean, we see, every time there's a new movie or a TV show, we see an influx of new readers. And one of the challenges that we have, because again, we have a library of stuff that goes all the way back to the beginning. And so when someone watches the Avengers movie and they come to our website, it's like, the challenge that we have is how do we get them to what they're looking for? Because literally you can find the 1960s Avengers sitting next to the 70s Avengers, next to the modern day Avengers. And it's like, figuring out what they like, getting them to where they can go, and building readers. And The Walking Dead, we get a lot of people coming in through The Walking Dead who like discover the TV show, and then they're like, wait, there's a comic book about this? Like, I want to read that. And then they get they get disappointed that Daryl's not in the comic book.
A lot of that.
Yeah. But yeah, we have, every year we do a survey to talk, to figure out what the people are reading, how they got into comics. We see a lot of people who are coming in digitally and then transitioning to print. From the beginning, we've had the ability to help people find, comic book stores so that we can basically turn them into voracious readers and into hardcore fans, because that benefits everybody. But it is a huge challenge. It's like, Ant-Man, or we'll have the Avengers movie will be out, and Flash, people coming in specifically looking for those things, and then, where do they go from there? But I would like to say that one of my Facebook friends is a woman who absolutely loves Daredevil, Flash, Arrow, has a huge crush on Steve Amell, actually got to meet him, has a picture of it. And this is a woman who, I don't actually think she read comics, I have to ask her, but loves these TV shows and has become like a huge fan of the genre as a result of it. Yeah.
Now, my last question before we go to audience Q&A is that it would be wrong to be sitting at Kickstarter and not mention that we are in a golden age of entrepreneurship in comics in a way that, the direct sales market period was an amazing period of entrepreneurship, because what you had to do then was solicit your book 2 or 3 months out. You'd get your numbers in. You'd know how many were ordered. You'd know if you could afford to print it. Stores would buy it to get it out there. And that seemed like an amazing breakthrough. The comic book market that started in '77 made it possible for us to have things that Jeanette Kahn could greenlight as experiments, like Dark Knight Returns. It made it possible for Kitchen Sink to do their Spirit reprints. It made it possible for Fantagraphics to become Fantagraphics. And that seemed like, this is amazing. We're able to do all of these things that we couldn't do on the newsstand. And where we are now with mechanisms like Kickstarter, with mechanisms like Comixology Submit, is that you don't even need to go through those channels to find an audience. You can go straight to your customers. You can go straight to your peers in a way that was, literally unfathomable, a decade ago? And so living in this golden age of entrepreneurship, serving these new audiences, what does that say for that was my timer, my time is up, but we'll go to you guys in a minute. What does that say about the future and where we are right now, that we are in this amazing period where people can really just take the reins of production into their own hands?
I have a friend who's an agent, and I get people, like, for example, I met a woman at a party. She said, oh, my nephew just graduated from the Kubert School, and he's looking for an agent, and he's trying to get published. What should he do? A librarian, I don't know. So I asked my friend who's an agent, I said, what do I tell people who ask me this? She said, tell her that her nephew doesn't need an agent, because an agent isn't going to be interested in his material until he or she knows it's commercially viable. But it's so easy to make your content commercially viable. You do it through social media. You put up a Tumblr, you get subscribers, you make a Facebook page, you tweet about it. You give people a look at what you're doing, and you build up. How many followers did Kate Beaton have before she got her print contract? Spike Trotman, she has an enormous number of followers on Twitter, and she turns that into massive Kickstarter success. You can get commercially viable without a publicist, without a publisher infrastructure. You can do it on your own now. And her recommendation was really that the kid look for a freelance editor just to make sure he can get his stuff into fighting trim. But there's so many avenues to publicize your work and to find a public that you don't even have to see face to face.
Robert Kirkman started Walking Dead on his own, completely self-financed it. And he said the smartest thing that he ever did was to hire an editor, because you need someone to help you rein in, to make sure that you're not going off on tangents, to make sure that you're following through on the stories, and to check your spelling.
Yes.
I mean, you would be amazed at how many submissions we get that just have bad grammar or spelling, and then you point it out to them. You say, there are spelling and grammar mistakes in here. You should reread it. And then you point out the ones that, you point out a couple to show them, and that's the only ones that they fix.
Like
so
students.
There's nothing, like I said before, there's nothing stopping you from getting your comic out there except for you. And one of the greatest things about this time right now is that you get instant feedback. You put it up on your Tumblr, you put it up on your Facebook, you put it on Twitter, or you put it on Comixology. You can get fan feedback, and that is immense. I mean, it's like you can find out what works, what doesn't work. You can interact with your fans. You can say, hey, I was thinking of, killing this character off. And then if, 1,000 people are like, don't do it, or, I'll come find you, then you don't do it.
That's how you know you have to do it.
Yeah, well, yeah.
It's a little nerve-wracking.
And then you build up, ancillary stuff around it. A lot of people, they go to cons and they, sell sketches and stuff, and it's like you just build up a fan base. And one of the creators that I talk to likes to say, reach out. If you're an aspiring creator, reach out to the people that you like online. A lot of them are happy to give you feedback and to help, because one of the things that I've noticed about comics is that I don't know many people who don't want to make comics better. Almost every single person I know in comics wants to. The thing that I like, that I hear the most, is that every single person that I know has come up with a plan to save comics. And it's like, this is my plan. This is how we're going to save comics. And it's like, well, I don't think we really need to save it. It's doing pretty good on its own. But I love the fact that you're into it. I love the fact that you love it. And people are just willing to help you do it.
So let's open up to you guys. We've got a mic on either side, so go ahead and raise your hand and find the mic, and we'll hear what you guys have to say.
How's it going? Sorry. Having met you guys all at different comic book events, I was wondering if there were plans that you do have to save comics that you haven't put into motion, I guess mostly around the more social aspects.
Didn't I do enough? I'm kidding. Finding ways to help people share and socialize their comics is one of the things that I'm really focusing on. When we first started Comixology Submit, we would send out an email the week before telling people that their books were coming out. And then what I noticed is, like I said earlier, no one would promote it. It would basically be going into the ether. They would know that it would come out, and maybe they would tell their friends, maybe they would post it on Facebook, but no one was really actively promoting it. So what I did was I changed the email that goes out on a weekly basis to include ways that you can market it. And I'll say, hey, use this URL. Here's this URL, this special URL that you can use that goes directly to your comic. It's got some stuff in there so that we can track it. If you paste it into Facebook, it's going to make this amazing post that's going to look great. If you put it on Twitter, you're going to get people who are going to click on it, and they're going to go and buy your book. As a matter of fact, here's a sample tweet of what you can say to put it on Twitter. And you know what? A lot of people just copy and paste and put that into Twitter, and I'll take it, because at least they're doing that. And then the very last thing is that I give them information on how to post it onto Tumblr. So educating people on how to socialize their books, how to promote it, creating tools to make that easier. Possibly, allowing you to embed it on your website so that people can see it and easily buy it, or giving ways for you to blast it out to your, to your followers, or teaching people how to create mailing lists. Those are all things that I'm currently thinking about.
Yeah, I think comics are doing just fine. I do think the thing that we're trying to do is just make them as accessible. I mean, it's the same thing that you're trying to do and doing such great work at, is just finding ways to make them accessible to everybody. Because I think for a long time they've been sort of like, I mean, many people have said this before, but they're a medium that people mistake for a genre. People think like, oh, comics are for a certain type of person. Like there's a category of person that likes comics. And I just don't think it's true. I actually think every person likes comics deep down. And just like every person likes, maybe there's 0.01% of people that doesn't like music or doesn't like movies, or like some freakish person out there. But I think it's just it's a thing that appeals very directly to people. And if you can just open up the medium to the idea that there's such a wide variety of things that are available, which there are, and that's a big part of what we try to do with our store, is just make it as unclubby as possible. Like a lot of comic shops have a kind of like, you got to be in the know to hang out there or whatever. And our favorite customers are the people who know absolutely nothing, because like they get so into it, and then they get to read like every masterpiece that's ever been created. I get jealous of those people. Because they get to spend 2 years just reading the greatest works in the history of this medium. So I think that's the only thing that comics really needs is just more avenues of access for people, and I think they're opening up very quickly.
And I like to put this into a little bit of perspective. Back in '96, I had this roundtable interview, and Will Eisner was on it. And back in the '90s, there was this amazingly horrible contraction in the comic book business because of some distribution maneuvers, and hundreds of stores died, and a lot of people lost their livelihood. And during this roundtable interview, which was about how are we going to save the business, Will Eisner said, I've seen this business die 5 times. This is an opportunity. So here we are in a boom period, and yeah, comics are doing just fine. Yeah. But they can still do better. Is there another question out here? Yeah.
My question was kind of around the field of like academic studies in comics. When she and Karen, I see like, yeah, I'm into this. So I'm curious, like now that comics are being more accepted into like mainstream culture and becoming actually considered more serious and not just for children, have you seen like a rise or a shift in like more academic like studies or around comics?
Yeah, there are so many university presses publishing secondary literature now. The Eisner Awards now has its own category for academic works, not simply things that are about comics, but things that are about comic studies. There was maybe 1 or 2 people teaching comics at Columbia when I started. Now there's probably half a dozen, and we have a whole program, the master's program in narrative medicine, which focuses heavily on illness narratives in graphic novel form. And the women who teach in this program are like, what's new? What's new? What's coming out about illness? What do you got on mental illness? What do you got on AIDS? What do you got on Alzheimer's? And there's a lot in there. You've got, professors like Hillary Chute at Chicago, who she just teaches comics. She's in the English department. She doesn't like teach a comics course in addition to the Wordsworth and Dickens and whatever. She just teaches comics. And I'm meeting more and more faculty, a guy named Ben Saunders at the University of Oregon, who's starting a comic studies program there. And I've been talking with a couple of professors who are comics friendly at Columbia about how we can perhaps get a comic studies program going at Columbia. So it's for a while, the only academic press was University Press of Mississippi, and they had a couple of comic studies series going. Now, Rutgers University Press, Columbia University Press, Harvard University Press, Yale University Press, California State University Press. There's so many presses that are publishing material. My friend Nick Suzanis did his dissertation at Teachers College on how visuals help in teaching. And he did his entire dissertation in comics form. That has just been published by Harvard University Press within a year of his defending it. I mean, it was like, boom, as soon as he had the doctor in front of his name, he had 3 different presses knocking on his door trying to get that thing published. So I think it's a great time to study comics in the university.
Because of the almost exclusive mainstream media coverage of these larger publishers, in conjunction with the proliferation of social media and indie access directly to customers, do you find that the disappointment that many consumers have in the print versions or issue versions of those mainstream comic books are drawing people to indie comic books, or do you find that there's kind of a split off in audience between those who like to watch live action versions of comic book characters and those who actually enjoy print and indie comic books?
That's for you, probably.
I didn't totally follow the question.
So do you find that there's a big split off in audience going between those who solely or primarily enjoy live action, like television or movies of these main publishers, or do you find that people who are equally interested in those also translate to readers of independent comic books? Or do you find that there's an audience shift where you either really like these independent comic books or you really enjoy these things and there isn't a huge amount of crossover?
I think for a lot of people that have, and all my experience is anecdotal, so I don't really know, but in my personal experience, I think that for a lot of people who've been comic fans for a long time, there is a significant division between those things. But I think for a lot of people who are coming in, who are brought in by some of these movies and shows, there's less of a division. Like I said, a lot of people come because they're interested in superheroes and end up reading non-superhero stuff. Because I think once you get interested in comics, you're going to start realizing there's all kinds of stuff out there. And I don't think that, with a fair number of exceptions, I don't think that the superhero movies and shows are all that similar to most superhero comics. So I think there's people who come into a comic shop expecting to become mega fans of superhero comics, and some of them do, but I think fewer than expected. And a lot of those people find their way into image books and stuff like that. So I think for new fans, I think a lot of those barriers are breaking down. Like there's people who follow certain creators who make both kinds of books or like good books. I don't think it's as much of a division between, like Marvel zombies and people who are, I think that's changing.
And we meet a lot of new people at conventions where we, go out there and spread the word about the fund. And I think that the divisions between mainstream or indie, like you kind of have to be steeped in comics to actually make those divisions. And I think that a lot of the people that are coming in, it's just comics and it's just story. And it's not the way it was, in the past where comics were this lower value art form where there was a stigma against it. I think people are just coming to story, and if it's a good story that grabs them, they'll read it and they don't care where it is. And sure, some people prefer motion pictures to books, and some people just want their Walking Dead wherever it is. And so the issue is, how do you make the most compelling story possible? Are there other questions out there? Do we have time?
I feel like maybe a lot of the conversation's been around a lot of domestic. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you guys have a lot of domestic experience just in general, but are the same trends happening internationally as well, in terms of digital comics and stuff? Like we all know Japan is like really big with manga and stuff, but like what are there international trends that are similar, or are they different?
Comics were already so popular in Europe. I mean, we had to surmount this kind of stigma, but they're spectacularly popular in Europe. I don't know what their digital profile is. I don't get the sense that I was at Angoulême this year, and I didn't see much digital anything. They like their print.
Yeah, they do like their print. Yeah, the Franco-Belgian market is it's about the same size as the U.S. market, probably a little bit larger. but it's a completely different way of viewing it. A lot of the books come out in what they call albums, and they only come out sporadically. They would basically be the equivalent of a graphic novel. And you can buy comic books, these albums in supermarkets. You know, they're pretty much everywhere.
Train stations.
Train stations. And what ends up happening is that when the next one comes out in the series, the family will actually buy it, and then they'll all read it together as like a family experience. It's a much different way of looking at things. And the French government has also been helping. Yeah. Like the French government has basically said that, you know, you have to charge the same price no matter where you buy it. So it's like there's no, you know, like you're going to get it for the same price at this store that you get it for this store. Digitally, we sell French content, but what we found is that, you know, when we first started, that we had 40% of our readers were international. Because we were opening up American comics internationally to an audience that really didn't have a chance to read it. You know, a lot of the American comics are packaged up by companies like Panini, who will do, you know, anthologies of like different mishmash of characters, and they're always like 6 months behind. You know, you'll get a comic that has like the Justice League cartoon adaptation plus like whatever the latest issue of Justice League is, and you know, and it's very hard for people to collect because they can't really get what it is they want. So yeah, we have a lot of people that buy internationally just because it's the first time that they've ever had that kind of access. And then the Japanese market is it's different. It's difficult. It's a huge market. I mean, it's a several billion-dollar market. A lot of people read digitally on their flip phones, like their feature phones. They don't even use smart devices. And one of the things with the Japanese market is that the creators really own all of their rights, and they can decide whether or not they want to release it digitally. So a lot of the older works where the creator has died and the family has no interest in seeing that work be republished, then it basically just disappears. Yeah, it's a huge shame.
One thing that is for sure is that comics are increasingly global. You know, I was coming back, I did a lecture in Oslo last month, and just coming back to the airport, there was like this huge display of American comics and Franco-Belgian comics at the airport so that you can read it before you go on the plane. Or when you go to Japan, there's the ad for the latest Marvel movie coming out, you know. So there really is a tremendous global interest in comics in a way that is continuing to grow, and so it is a increasingly common language.
And there's more crossover now because you don't need to be in the same city as the publisher.
Yeah.
So you can have, you know, a comic done by somebody in Singapore that's published in America, and so that kind of brings the markets.
To say nothing of Tumblr.
Cross-pollination. To say nothing of Tumblr.
Yeah.
Just a vast sink.
Hey there. So I have a question about technology from today, but John's comment about the train stations in Europe really make me miss the technology that brought me into comics, which is the obsolete tech of the spinner rack. Long missed. But so my question is really for Karen. There's a ton of great comics happening entirely online, no print version, especially web comics. And I'm just curious if there's any libraries out there that are looking into making archives of some of that stuff, because, you know, when some of those folks just get done with their site and they're not getting read much anymore and they're not making anymore, they're just going to shut them down and they're going to disappear. So I was just curious if anyone is doing any work on that.
That is such a good question. As far as I know, no one's doing that. And there is a protocol for that. There's a way to do it. At Columbia, we have this thing called the Human Rights Documentation Center, and we're archiving human rights websites because they also disappear often without a trace for reasons that are much more sinister than simply a person deciding not to write comics anymore. So we could absolutely do this with web comics, but it's money. You know, you need somebody to fund a project like that. And I'm literally not aware. I don't even necessarily catalog a whole lot of web comics in our online catalog because because of the comments, I guess, more than anything else. That's not something I kind of want to bring into the environment of things that I've vetted, because people can be so horrible. But no, that's something that's an ephemeral form that is going to disappear unless somebody does something about it. And I don't know who's going to do that at the moment. Before we wrap up, can I say one last thing? I completely forgot to plug the film itself. I realized as soon as I sat down, it's like, oh my God, I didn't even have a slide with like the logo of the film on it. If you want to watch She Makes Comics, which is a wonderful documentary about women in comics, you can go to sequart.org, sequart.org, and you can buy a DVD or you can do a digital download. And I'm going to look right at the camera and apologize to Marissa and Patrick and Jordan, who were my co-producers. Marissa directed it, for not putting that up sooner. So, okay.
And we still have time for about 1 or 2 more questions out there in the back.
Yeah, do you think the comic market is saturated? If yes, how does a comic separate itself?
How does the comic, what was the last?
How does a comic, say, creator or comic book separate itself from all the comics that are out there now?
Well, use ringtones. Yeah, this is, like we've said before, there's an amazing amount of content out there right now, and getting discovered is becoming more and more difficult. And there are a lot of great tools that you can use to help get yourself noticed. Jason Brubaker, who did a book called Remind, one of the things that helped him to be very successful is that he put tutorials up on his website. So he would actually talk through the process of how he would do things. He actually, Jason Brubaker at the time, had the most successfully funded Kickstarter program in the comics category. He has since been, eclipsed by, Gail Simone and some other people. But what he did was he talked about the experience, and he actually wrote a book about the experience. And here's the thing, like you're asking us questions about how to better do something. There are millions of people out there thinking the exact same thing, and they're looking for anyone who has done it and how to do it better. So he would put these tutorials up on his website talking about this stuff, and people typing into Google, how do I make a comic, would find his website and become a fan, and then that would help him stand out. And it doesn't hurt that Jason's work is absolutely amazing. If you haven't seen Remind, I highly recommend it. It's actually on Comixology Submit, nice little plug there. But talk about it, go on social media, interact with other creators, interact with people like yourself who are looking for this information. I mean, there's a huge community dying to know these answers, and that will really help you stand out.
You're talking about these tutorials reminds me, Reuben Bowling has his Inner Hive. I don't know if you know about this. Reuben Bowling, who does Tom the Dancing Bug, you can pay, I don't know, is it $10 a year, $10 a month, $10 every 2 months? I have no idea. It's just all credit cards, and I don't even see what's happening behind the scenes. And if you sign up to be part of his Inner Hive, then every week you get an email with an advanced look at that week's cartoon, and he tells you a little bit about the process. Sometimes he puts up, kind of his roughs and his early sketches. He also throws in a little classic Tom the Dancing Bug at the end. So you get this kind of, you're invited into this person's world, and you've got a way to think about that comic that gives it more depth and more nuance than simply seeing it in one of the Go Comics pages as they speed past you. So there's ways to differentiate yourself, but it's tricky. I was at a panel a few years ago at the Whitney with Art Spiegelman and Chris Ware and Gary Panter. It was for the Lionel Feinegger exhibition. And somebody in the audience said, now that comics have become so popular, is it harder to, is there a steeper curve to have the kind of success that you've had? And I'm thinking, if you want the success Art Spiegelman had, it helps to be Art Spiegelman. But Gary Panter said, you know, if you're going into comics to make a living and to be successful, you really need to rethink your life. He said, Gary Panter said, I don't make money, I don't make my living off comics. I make my living off my fine art commissions. You know, somebody like Peter Cooper, I imagine, makes his living off his illustration. And, you know, there's a lot of other things that you're doing to be successful. You make comics because it's what you have to do, not because it's your career path.
Well, I also think there's, I mean, like you guys were saying, there's just an insane amount of young cartoonists who are appearing and putting their stuff online and showing up at conventions. It seems like there are, the number of cartoonists seems like it's growing faster than the number of readers, even the number of readers is growing too. But I wonder if due to stuff like Kickstarter and crowdfunding, Patreon and stuff like that, if maybe it's quite as necessary to have as many fans or readers as it used to be. Because it seems like there's new models that reward depth of your relationship with your fans more so than number. Because you might, if like you were saying, if there's a person who really makes you feel like you have a personal relationship with them, and you often really can have a personal relationship with the people who are your readers and fans, you can support their Patreon, you can get high-level rewards off their Kickstarter. It's not just, well, that's one sale for each book that I make. So maybe you don't have to, it's like, I always thought about that, there's the Andy Warhol quote, in the future everybody's going to be famous for 15 minutes. But maybe it's in the future everybody's going to be famous to 15 people, which I think is where we're at right now. Like, I meet people who seem famous to me, and I don't think they feel famous at all. I just read their blog or whatever. So, yeah, maybe that's one step in that direction.
And speaking of fame, I think that our host, Jamie, wants to, the amazing cartoonist, Jamie Tanner, by the way.
Is this thing on? Yeah, thank you so much to our panelists, Chad Brownstein, Karen Green, Josh O'Neill, John Roberts. Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and let's hear it for our amazing panel.